Ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in welcoming Minister Chun Singh.
ESM Go, MEI Chairman Bilahari, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to all of you. Let me first wish everyone a happy, healthy, and successful Lunar New Year. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar this morning. I'm keenly aware of the number of distinguished Middle East experts in the room. I'm not a Middle East expert. I hope to share another outside-in geopolitical perspective on the region and add to the conversation today. I will first make some observations on the complexities of the Middle East and discuss how China and the US will add to the complexities in the coming years. Then we can have a deeper conversation after the speech during the discussion session. So let me start. First observation. The intra-Middle East rivalries and contests for power, ideology, and religion will intensify in the foreseeable future. Since time immemorial, this area, often referred to as the cradle of civilization, has seen attempts at domination from people as diverse as the Egyptians, Persians, Arabs, Romans, Ottomans, British, French, and many others. I'm always reminded that once when I visited Jerusalem many years back, and I was shown a model of the layers of history literally under the Jerusalem soil. And the docent was explaining to me who have been here. I left with the strong memory that I think almost everyone, less the Singaporeans and the Eskimos, have been there in the many thousand years. In the last century alone, we have seen the Arab-Israeli conflicts, the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, the Iran-Iraq wars, the Gulf War, the Syrian and Yemeni civil wars, the Iraqi insurgencies, the rise and fall of ISIL, but to name a few. Even by most conventional and historical standards, the region today is seeing unprecedented levels of instability and fluidity. Many commentators attribute this to the heightened uncertainties today brought about by two sets of forces. One, the collapse of the old world order, from the Iranian Revolution to the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, and the fragmentation of the Arab core. All these have contributed to the current state of flux and instability. The rise of competing ideologies like ISIS is but a symptom of the wider lack of stability and leadership. So it's a symptom and not just a cause. The other reason being the lack of a clear regional or global geostrategic heavyweight that is able to keep things in check. While external powers have often added to the potent Middle East concoction, they have at times also provided the stabilizing force amidst the shifting power relativities in the region. We do not have that heavy weight at this point in time. Second observation. The Middle East remains a platform for proxy power contests. The Middle East has always been part of a bigger global chessboard. The region has been a place of real and proxy contests in areas ranging from religion, energy, to pure power play. Religion is an inescapable part of the Middle East reality. We know that religion is not always the most important factor. Often it is but a cover for other interests like energy and geopolitical power contests. Geostrategically, the Middle East challenge is because it is middle, as Prof. Ho suggested. It's middle between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It controls the critical strategic lines of communications, or slots as we call it, in air, land, and sea. So if you come from Europe to Asia, you have to pass through that region, particularly after the Suez Canal. In the air SLOC or Air Strategic Lines of Communications, the Middle East within a 6-hour radius would cover the bulk of Europe, West Asia, and almost reaching Southeast Asia and East Asia. Thus, for many, if not all, in global and regional powers in history, many, if not all, desire to secure their interests in the region. That includes their lines of strategic communications, energy, and even religious authority. Since the Middle East has seldom been unified, it has also become a convenient proxy battleground for wider geopolitical contests. The more unstable the Middle East, the greater the potential for it being a proxy for external power contests. Third observation, the Middle East, blessed with abundant energy resources combined with its ideological power, has the potential to influence the rest of the world. We have seen different strands of Islamic and other religious teachings emanating from the region to other parts of the world, powered by energy money. Other regions, such as Southeast Asia, are recipients of this global proxy ideological contests. With this ideological power play, the Middle East is no longer just a passive receiver of external power play. Now it can become its own exporter of its own power play. With this context, let me now move on to China's interest in the Middle East. For a long time in recent decades, China has not been a significant player in the Middle East. However, as China resumes its historical global weight, we should not be surprised by the growing China's interest in the Middle East. Like any global power in history, China will have its fair share of interest in the Middle East, ranging from the same interest as the security of its strategic lines of communications, its resources in oil and gas, and even religion, particularly the influence of Islam on China's Muslim minorities. Hence, we should certainly expect China's interest in, as well as efforts to engage the region, to continue to grow. China's physical presence in the region is just but one part of the equation. Its economic and ideological presence must also be factored in the wider outreach plan. Historically, Western powers moved and stayed in the Middle East as part of its eastward push. Now, China is increasingly an important player there with its own westward push. If the region is Middle East to the west, then the same region can be argued as the Middle West to China. Scholars have and will continue to debate if China has the same colonialist or expansionist intent towards the Middle East. Some scholars interpret China's recent moves to establish its physical and military presence in the Middle East as a sign of China's expansionist tendencies. Yet other scholars have cited China's innate inward-looking continental mentality as suggesting China's aversion to interference of other countries. Having been brought up in the military, I have never been very sure that there is anything very innate about the way countries try to secure their interests. All countries try to secure their interests through all dimensions of their power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So perhaps China and the US and many other global powers in history have more in similarities than differences. What is more important is to understand each of their interests in any particular region, and in this case, Middle East, and see how it seeks to achieve their respective interests in the least costly way possible for them. This applies equally to all global powers throughout history. Force is always a last resort, but nevertheless a recourse when all else fails. We can view China's moves in the Middle East through the Belt and Road Initiative, its ambitious effort to improve regional cooperation and connectivity on a transcontinental scale. The Belt and Road Initiative is often viewed with both suspicion and positivism. Some observers see the Belt and Road Initiative as a push for Chinese domination in global affairs with a China-centered trading network. Others label it as a form of neocolonialism, moving countries and states closer to the China's orbit. These observers point to the reports of white elephants and crippling debts afflicting some member countries or some participating countries as proof of China's ill intent. However, if conducted with prudence and financial discipline in an open and inclusive manner, the Belt and Road Initiative is also an opportunity, a major opportunity to fill the infrastructure gaps in the region, including those in the Middle East. With the Belt and Road Initiative, China has the capacity to undertake large infrastructure projects and the appetite to do so in risky regions where many others may be reluctant. So the question is, can the Middle East country benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative? My answer is yes, if each and every project is evaluated according to economic principles and executed with market discipline, keeping non-economic considerations furthest away possible. This is the responsibility not just of China, but of each and every recipient partner countries. However, the Middle East is also one of the most complex regions in the world. No major power has been able to avoid getting entangled in the region's complex geopolitics. Will China have the capacity to navigate the Middle Eastern politics without being entangled like many others which came before it? That will certainly be one of the key questions to explore. And does China have the desire to replace the US as a big brother in the Middle East? I do not believe so at this point in time. At this point in time, China's focus on trade and infrastructure thus far is more defensive than offensive. It is one thing for China to want to secure its interests in the Middle East. It is another for China to contest other powers in the Middle East as part of the wider geopolitical chess game. Many have asked, as China steps up, will the US step off? Various people have suggested that shale gas, the misperception that the global war on terrorism is largely over, and the waning American public appetite for foreign interventions and global constabulary responsibilities have all combined to diminish the US interest in the Middle East. The US will certainly recalibrate its posture in the Middle East as its interests evolve. But to then conclude that the US is no longer interested in the region is premature, or as they say, greatly exaggerated. The US still have plenty of interest in the Middle East, ranging from its geostrategic presence, its strategic lines of communications, and religion. As such, both the US and China have interests in the Middle East that are sometimes shared and at other times contested as part of the wider global backdrop of cooperation and contest between the US and China. Russia, Turkey, and Iran, or others, will be watching this US-China relationship closely. Nature abhors a vacuum, geopolitics more so. Like elsewhere in the world, a vacuum left by the US and China will always be contested and filled by other powers. Already, we are seeing unprecedented level of contest by key regional states such as Turkey and Iran. This is perhaps fueled by the geostrategic uncertainty with the fracturing of the Arab core. As the intra-regional dynamics and proxy contests by extra-regional powers intensify, the changing demographics and shifting aspirations of the Arab core, particularly the youth, will further complicate the stability of various countries and the region as a whole. The Middle Eastern youths have seen new possibilities with the 2011 Arab Spring. Will they push for Revolution 2.0, or will it be a forced dawn, having seen the disastrous consequences in revolts in places such as Libya and Yemen? So these are the many interesting questions that we can explore, and I'll be happy to end my sharing here and continue the discussion after this. Thank you very much.
Once again, Minister, for being with us today and for your opening address. I will exercise the moderator's privilege to ask the first question. but then I'll open the floor. I just ask the audience one favor. Uh, Parliament is sitting today, and it starts at 11. The Minister is on a tight schedule. So please make sure your questions are really questions and not speeches in disguise. In other words, be brief. Uh, Minister, you, Professor Ho, have more or less made the same point that we should be interested in the Middle East. We can't ignore the Middle East. I would like you, as a member of the Singapore Cabinet, one of our fourth generation, to speak directly to Singaporeans who may not be in the audience. If there is one single sentence, if you could encapsulate in one single sentence why we should be interested in the Middle East, what would that sentence be?
Simply this: whatever happens and not happens in the Middle East, we cannot be independent from the direct and indirect impact. So it behooves us as Singaporeans, especially as being part of the Southeast Asian region, to truly understand what is happening there. Maybe at this point in time, I will explain the wider context of what it means. Much has been talked about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's geostrategic perspective. Uh, Maybe I use the analogy of the Weiqi chessboard, the game of Go. If China is at the center, then China has four meridian points: northeast, southeast, southwest, and northwest. If you look at it from that perspective, then you know that China needs to secure as many of its meridian points as possible. Traditionally, the northeast may not be that amicable to China's influence because of historical factors. And the northeast is Korea and Japan. So it's no surprise for China to want to extend its meridian points towards the northwest, towards Europe, even across land, which is highly expensive and difficult to connect across the vast space of geography from West China all the way to Europe. This is the reason why China will build the Yixing-O railway all the way from Chongqing to Duisburg. It tries, it's not easy because it's very difficult to ship 20-foot containers from China all the way across land to Europe. It's very expensive. The price point is not correct. It's still cheaper to sail by the longer way around the sea. But if it has to sail around the sea, then there are two particular choke points that you will be very concerned with. One is the Middle East, in particular the Suez Canal region. The second is the Southeast Asia, particularly the South China Sea and Malacca Straits. So China has a lot of interest to make sure that these two geostrategic areas are at least friendly to them and will not hinder, hinder their outward reach. But beyond the sea route, there are also the land routes, which is why coming out from the southeast or the southwest is important. And China's traditionally will be very fearful if it is being circumscribed by the sea. So while China, as many have read, as a continental power, China also has maritime interests and land interests to make sure that its meridian points are not choked. On the other hand, the US has the same interests in both Northeast Asia and Southwest Asia. But for the US to connect Northeast Asia with Southwest Asia, then Southeast Asia is important. And that's why for Singapore, in Southeast Asia, we are actually, just like the Middle East, in an area where both of the major powers in the world would have a lot of interest to secure their respective interests in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia. So in this context, there is all the more reason why Singaporeans should be keenly aware of what happens in the Middle East and to draw some lessons from it. One of the lessons that we can draw is that if the region is not integrated, is not coherent, then the region can be a platform for many proxy contests. And we don't want that to happen here, which is why it's in the interest of ASEAN countries to work closely together to make sure that we can chart our way forward, without which we may end up being a battleground for proxy interests.
Thank you, Minister. The floor is now open. Please just identify yourself, put up your hand, identify yourself.
Thank you very much, Minister. My name is Shikata from Japan Forum on International Relations. Let me ask you about ASEAN collective approach on Indo-Pacific outlook. I understand ASEAN is on seeking for its own cooperation, together with China's BRI and Japan's, Australia's, US, India's Indo-Pacific strategy. So what is the concrete image of ASEAN collective approach on the Indo-Pacific outlook? In relation to that, there seems to be some differences of opinions among ASEAN member states from time to time because of the decision-making process is based upon consensus and consultation. Does ASEAN have any idea to modify such decision-making process for quick action? Thank you very much.
The short answer is that in any regional bloc, you will have different interests amongst the different countries. ASEAN is no different. Europe has its own dynamics as well, and likewise for any other regional blocs. But I think what is common amongst all the ASEAN countries is this. Everyone is very clear that ASEAN doesn't want to be a battleground for proxy contests. ASEAN, all the countries in ASEAN believe that it is in our ASEAN's individual and collective interest to remain connected to the rest of the world and to the major blocs and the major superpowers. I don't think any ASEAN countries prefer to choose sides. I think ASEAN countries would like to see themselves being connected to the US, to China, to Europe. And that is how ASEAN will find its footing in the new geopolitical dynamics. So if that is what we believe in, then we will do all we can to make sure that we stay engaged and connected and be a neutral place where people from elsewhere can come and be engaged in this region.
Farishno, RSIS and MEI. Minister, you talked about the need for Singaporeans and people in Southeast Asia to understand the dynamics of China's relations with Middle East. This is a question from an academic. Do you see that this offers us an opportunity to further expand and develop area studies in particular? Studies of Middle East, but also Central Asia and Africa. Because in my experience going through universities in Southeast Asia, I see a great level of general public apathy and ignorance about these parts of the world, which, as you pointed out, are actually tied to our political and economic interests in our region as well. So do you envisage a development of area studies in these three regions?
Answer is yes. As part of the wider backdrop, Singapore's survival and success will definitely require every generation of Singaporeans to be closely clued in to what's happening around the world, especially key regions around the world like Middle East and increasingly in Central Asia and the growing economies in Africa. Singapore cannot be so insular to not have to think about what happens elsewhere. Our very survival is dependent on our connectivity to the rest of the world. Our survival, the principles of our survival has not changed since 1965. And that is, for us to be successful, we must remain connected to the world. We must never be circumscribed by our geography nor our neither by our geographical size nor location. And to do that, the world must be our hinterland. For the world to be truly our hinterland, then we must have a deep understanding of what's happening around the world, not just the US and China or Europe, but many of these other places like Middle East, the Central Asian republics, and also increasingly Africa. When we are globally aware, then we can understand clearly how to position ourselves so that we maintain our relevance to each and every one. We can't connect to the other people on the basis that they exercise charity or sympathy towards us. We can only connect to the rest of the world if we understand what other people's interests are, how we can play a role so that we remain relevant to them. And this is why we always encourage fellow Singaporeans to travel as widely as possible, not just through the usual well-trodden path, but also to truly understand different parts of the world, bring back something to Singapore so that we can enrich our understanding of different parts of the world, how they interact with one another, and how Singapore can play a role.
I have two questions. That gentleman over there, and then Zainul.
Mr. Minister, John Alterman from CSS in Washington. You've had China as a neighbor for centuries, and you've seen the way China deals with its immediate neighborhood. China has recently reached out to Africa. China's reached out to Latin America. As somebody who's a neighbor of China, are you seeing China working farther afield, much the way it works in its own neighborhood? Or do you see China treating things further away differently than it treats its own near abroad?
There are similarities and yet there are differences. Of course, you are right that the countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia have been neighbors with China for more than 2,000 years. So there's a certain understanding of how the dynamics work. Going further afield in Latin America, in Africa, China will have to deal with those countries to secure its interests in slightly different ways, but I don't think the fundamentals differ that much, right? Which is that for a country to secure its interests, it will have to play its cards right across all its dimensions of power: diplomatic, informational, military, or economics. And that, I think, forms the basis of how any major power interacts with any other power. But of course, the depth of understanding, the depth of relationship, understanding, I don't mean China's understanding of that particular country, but the mutual understanding, that certainly will be different between, say, Southeast Asia and Latin America vis-a-vis China.
Okay. We will have to stop pretty soon, but I can take a few more questions. First, Zainul, Errol, and the gentleman waiting there. And then I think we'll have to call it quits because the minister, as I said, has to be in Parliament.
Thank you, Chairman Bilahari, for your patience. I have a question on Singapore as the pivot. We are here to talk about the Middle East as a pivot. I think, Minister, you have reminded us recently how Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I suppose indeed Mr. Goto, reminding Singaporeans to always be relevant to the world. We were an important interlocutor for China when China was emerging, but the world has changed. And how do you see Singapore continuing to be that pivot? Is it still the technology, which we are ahead in many other countries? Is it about governance, minority Muslims in Singapore, in majority Chinese Singapore? Or do you see also any role for the minority Muslims in Singapore to be a possible pivot as Singapore looks to the Middle East and its role with the greater Asia? Thank you.
First, let me declare that I'm always very conscious when people use the word pivot. I do not want to overstate our utility to the rest of the world. We are a small country. We are acutely aware of what we can do and what we cannot do. Singapore is only relevant to the world if we understand their respective interests and see how we can value add. I won't overplay to say that we have tremendous influence on many other parts of the world or the powers to be. On your specific point about China, so Singapore's relationship with China evolves with the times. In the early years, when China was very keen on its economic development, we went into Suzhou even after the Tiananmen incident, as not just to do the hard and software transfer, but it's also a testimony of our confidence and support for China's development. We believe that a successful China, a stable China is good for China, good for the region, good for the world. But as China's needs evolve, our relevance to China also evolves. So we started with Suzhou as an industrial park, mainly for economic development, of course with much of a software transfer as well, has then since evolved to the Tianjin Eco-City project, which epitomizes China's desire for sustainable development. By the 2010s, when we embarked on the third development project, the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative, it has gone beyond a geographically bounded project like an industrial park or an eco-city. Instead, it is about connectivity, connecting the western provinces of China, connecting those provinces with countries outside China in Southeast Asia. So the entire concept is very different. What other areas can Singapore play a role in the next step of China's development? I think there are at least two. When China talks about the BRI initiatives and it wants to look at third countries' cooperation, Singapore comes to mind. And Singapore comes to mind not because we have deeper pockets than the Chinese, but Singapore comes to mind because of the way we evaluate the projects economically on market principles, the way we execute the projects provides the investors, both in China and elsewhere, confidence that such projects are evaluated thoroughly on market principles. So this is something that we are working with the Chinese in third countries. So this is one possibility. Coupled with this is also the rule of law, which is why a lot of the Chinese outward investments come through Singapore and they are syndicated through Singapore. So the work of Infrastructure Asia will contribute towards this end, whereby we provide our legal and financial syndication expertise to couple with the financial resources of China. So this one set of area, this is one area where Singapore can contribute to China's outward push in its connectivity with the rest of the world. The other part, as you have suggested, that is of interest to China is how Singapore can continue to remain successful and cohesive with a diverse and multi-ethnic population. Of course, what we do here may not be able to be replicated by China in all ways. But China, I think, through their conversations with us, finds us quite interesting, if you like. Quite interesting because they try to understand how we can keep a multi-ethnic, multi-racial society together. One that does not have a lot of common history, but one that is united by a common vision, a set of values, meritocracy, incorruptibility, multiracialism. These are things which China, in its next lap of development, will find pretty interesting to see how they can maintain their social stability amidst all the disparate forces trying to pull the Chinese society apart. But having said that, I must say this. Singapore is only relevant to the world if Singapore remains successful. We can have great theories on how we manage ethnic relationship. We can have great theories on how we manage economic development and so forth. But nobody will believe us if we are not successful. And for us to continue to be successful, we have to continue to get our fundamentals right. Good governance, a cohesive population, the ability of the leadership to take hard decisions for the long-term good of our people. So these are some of the fundamentals which I think will put us in good stead. And so long as we are successful, be it China or anyone else, I think they will find something interesting in Singapore's model.
Okay, last two questions. First, Ariel, and then the gentleman behind you.
Minister, I'm Ariel Cohen from Washington, D.C., the Atlantic Council. You had made some excellent points, and your description of the role and approach of Singapore makes me think that you will be the right person to advise the U.S. how to proceed with our delay in membership in TPP. I think it was a huge mistake. And how should we go about it so that we don't de facto abandon this area to our peer competitors? Thank you.
Again, as many of you know, neither myself as an individual nor my government profess to be advisors to the US or China's and the powers to be. But since you are on the topic of TPP, I think everybody who had played a part in trying to bring the TPP about, including many in the US establishment, understood the benefits of the TPP, not just as an economic project for greater connectivity to allow respective countries to leverage on their respective comparative advantage to bring about better growth and better jobs, better lives for their people. I think that part everybody understood. And that was the reason why the US went into the TPP. But the reason why the US decided to leave the TPP is quite different. All of us know that globalization, greater integration will bring about greater benefits for everybody. But that doesn't mean that the benefits are shared similarly, and that doesn't mean that everybody will necessarily benefit. In any globalization, within a country, adjustments are required. There will be some who gain more, some who gain less. There will be some who might actually not gain as much. And these people who have either not gained or not gained as much will require the help of some central government or agencies to help them adjust their business model, reskill them in order for them to keep pace with the developments on the globalization front. Now, having said that, the US government today will be a reflection of the US domestic politics. So until and unless the US can resolve some of these issues, the US domestic politics will be divided as to whether to support not just the TPP, but whether the US will continue to believe in global integration. Or will the US prefer and decide that the pain is too much, that it is easier, better for them to decide to build a wall around themselves, literally, and then go on a different trajectory. So to me, I don't think the US need convincing of the benefits of TPP. What the US need to do is to resolve some of the internal contradictions within the US society. Can the states in the East and West Coast that have benefited most from globalization be able to redistribute some of the benefits to help the other states who have not benefited as much to keep pace? If the US can do this, then I think the mood will turn. This is no different from the situation in the UK for Brexit. Why is it that the vote in London is all anti-Brexit, whereas the mood elsewhere outside London is so much for Brexit? Never mind the pros and cons, never mind the real economic arguments. But the sentiment that, am I able to keep pace? Absolutely and relatively. And that is important. So this is a challenge not just for the US, for Europe. I would say that this is a challenge for every country. The crux of the matter is this. In each and every country, will they have the strong, able and willing government to take charge of the situation, to help their businesses improve, help their workers improve, to keep pace with globalization? If this cannot be solved domestically, then it will lead to a global backlash with global repercussions. So I don't think the US establishment need more convincing about the benefits of TPP, global integration, the US leadership in the global arena. What the US need to fix is these internal challenges, and if that can be fixed, then I think we can have a new conversation within the US. That's my own view.
All right, the gentleman who has been waiting so patiently. Last question.
Good morning, Minister and Chairman. Edmund with NTU. My question is similar to what Mr. Zainal asked. I mean, we have a good pool of students and graduates from our local madrasas. Many have interest in the Middle East. What are your views about how we can further develop this group of students who are studying about the Middle East and who are also interested deeply about Middle East? And if you can just elaborate on some of the aspects of the key strategies moving ahead in terms of how Singapore can engage and respond to the various Middle East influence, particularly in terms of religion. Thank you.
So two parts to the answer. The first is that I don't think our interest in the Middle East is restricted to those who go there from the madrasas and elsewhere. In fact, there are many other students who go to the Middle East or who study the Middle East who are not from the madrasas. So regardless of where they come from and where they are going, I think so long as they have an interest in the region, we would like to encourage them to develop a deep interest, to develop those deep instincts of what are the forces at play in the Middle East. And the Middle East, just before we came in, we were just joking that if you're a professor in the Middle East, it's a lifetime employment, because there's never shortage of things to keep professors highly engaged on what will happen next in the Middle East. So the first step is that, yes, we would like many more Singaporeans to be interested in regions like the Middle East so that we have a deep understanding of what's happening there and how things that happen there can impact on us. your second point, let me give a broader answer to your second point. I don't think it's just the different strands of a religious thinking emanating from the Middle East that will always be a challenge to how Singapore keep our society united and cohesive. Singapore is a small country with relatively little history in the yardstick of a human race. We have only 53 years old. And for a country with only 53 years of history, anything that happens elsewhere will tend to have an impact on us, pulling our population in different directions. And you will not be surprising that things that happen in China, things that happen in India, things that happen in Malaysia, things that happen in Middle East will all be pulling Singapore in different directions because of the traditional influences that they have. This is not something that will go away in the short term. It is not something that will miraculously disappear tomorrow. What we have always to be careful is that we are first and foremost Singaporeans with our own set of identity, with our own interests. We draw our strength from the diverse roots that we come from, but we are all united by a common vision, a common destiny. We are Singaporeans not because we are just merely descendants of people from different parts. We have our own unique vision, our own unique set of values that define us from being a Singaporean. Which is why I always say that Singaporeans are never defined just by our history. It is also defined by our sense of identity, our set of values that unite us together. And if we look at that, not many societies have this form of organizing principles. Most societies organize themselves on the basis of a backward-looking historical or ancestry concept. For us, since we don't have too much of that, we also organize ourselves, and perhaps more importantly, organize ourselves on a forward-looking basis of a set of values and institutions that we believe in and that we can chart a course for ourselves and our children. So with that as the context, that comes to your question. So be it the different strands of Islam, the different strands of other religious teachings, they will all have a direct and indirect impact on the psyche and identity of Singaporeans. But what we work very hard is to make sure that we build our own sense of identity, drawing strands from these different roots, but not being captured by any one particular roots.
Thank you, Minister. Can you all join me in thanking